You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
U.S. fighter jets strike targets in Syria. Is this the second front? Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As American jets hit two facilities believed to be used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. This as Israel conducts new raids inside Gaza. We're going to take the wide view on what could become a regional conflict if it isn't already, with James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, now chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, is back with us here on Bloomberg. The new Speaker of the House says he wants to bifurcate Israeli funding. We'll have that and a lot more as well with our signature panel on this Friday. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Welcome to the Friday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I actually had to check a couple of times. It has been a week. At least we have a Speaker of the House to show for it. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. It's great to see you. Join us on YouTube along with the radio or the satellite. We've got the cameras lit and love to have you join us here in the studio. Go to YouTube and search Bloomberg Global News. We've got a lot to talk about here today as we begin with the situation in Israel. I really should say the Middle East, because we're talking about a regional story at this point here. The latest from Israel, as I read on the terminal, they sent troops on a limited raid into Gaza for the second night running here, kind of punching holes in things, getting ready for surveilling, doing a lot of things ahead of what will likely be a ground invasion. But we're seeing headlines now on extensive bombing to the north, in northern Gaza. Phone service and internet service has completely gone down. We may be in the midst of something here that is important. Massive airstrikes underway now. As we learn as well, the U.S. was flying jets in Syria yesterday, and this is important. It's where we want to get started with Ambassador Jeffrey back with us today. F-16s flown by the United States, striking targets in eastern Syria believed to be used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, raising great questions about the scale of this potential military conflict. He was, of course, the ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, also special presidential envoy for the global coalition to counter ISIS. He's now at the Wilson Center, where he chairs the Middle East program. Ambassador James Jeffrey, welcome back. Sir, it's good to see you. I wonder your thoughts when you hear news like this. This is not a proxy war when American jets are striking targets, is it?
Thank you for having me on, Joe. It's important to know this is as important as Ukraine, not only for the survival of a state, because that's what's in play, but secondly, the American capability all across the world. This collective security system that's been in place since 1945 produced prosperity, peace, and political freedom for much of the world. Hamas is allied with Iran and Iran's other allies, including Hezbollah, a very powerful force in southern Lebanon. The risk is, if the Israelis go in on the ground, which they seem to be preparing to do, as you just said, that Iran and Hezbollah will strike Israel, or possibly strike the United States, which has put forces in the region exactly to deter intervention from the outside. What we have now is low-skill shooting back and forth between the United States and Iranian surrogates in Syria and in Iraq to try to maintain a lid on this, but there's no telling where this will go.
Well, there sure isn't. Does it make you nervous when you see U.S. aircraft inside Syria, knowing that there could be Iranian involvement at any moment, never mind Iranian cooperation with Syria?
Well, we've had, of course, aircraft there for a long time fighting the Islamic State, at times attacking the Syrian government, as you know, wiping out the Wagner battalion. In Syria, which I was responsible for 2 years, is a rock and roll battle zone and always has. That's why we took targets out of Iranian surrogates in Syria. Nobody will mind. The bigger and juicier targets, of course, are in Iraq, but that's a fairly friendly government. We don't want to bomb their territory. And the most important are in Iran, but that would be an escalation. What the Biden administration is saying is that day is coming if you start killing Americans, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, the headlines that are crossing now are potentially significant, Ambassador. The Palestinian telecom provider now says that internet service throughout the Gaza Strip has been cut off by Israeli bombardment. What does that tell you about the next phase and how soon it might begin?
I don't want to be cynical or satirical, but frankly, I'm wondering what took the Israelis so long. This is the main vehicle for Hamas to get their propaganda out. And also, frankly, to communicate with each other, of course, as we saw in the attack on Israel on the 7th of October. Hamas has very extraordinary technical and electronic capabilities. What the Israelis have been doing with this bombing, in part, is to knock that down. And that was another step today. Again, it indicates they're thinking of a ground incursion much bigger than the ones they've done so far.
Right. Sending troops in and what they're referring to as a limited raid. They actually had troops and armor rolling into Gaza last night. Some thought it might be the beginning of something larger. What type of operation do you think that was? Are they actually just surveying land, looking for tunnels, or are they doing more in terms of taking out targets while they're at it?
Yeah, as a former tank commander, I recognize this doctrinally. It's called a tank raid. It is designed to, another doctrinal term, prepare the battlefield by probing enemy weak points, seeing how they react, seeing how their communications light up when you send forces in, and in general, putting them off base, because soon Hamas will get used to these Israeli raids and will be less quick to react when the big one comes.
Well, we may see more of these, I suppose, but it doesn't signify anything to you in terms of timeline, as in going in tonight or this weekend, Ambassador?
No, a very good question. First of all, as your viewers know, because everybody's following this, there are other issues. We need to get American air defense reinforcements throughout the Middle East so that we can shoot down these drones and missiles that Iran is firing at us, rather than taking casualties and having to strike back. That's an escalatory, de-escalatory thing. Secondly, there's negotiations over many of the civilian hostages. There's also concerns about getting assistance to the civilian population that is in dire need in Gaza. All of those things will feed into the Israeli planning, including intelligence on Hamas and probably refinements of the plan. This will be an extremely complicated operation. Nobody would try this unless, A, you had 360,000 troops, and B, you thought your country's existence depends upon it. But that's where I believe Israel is today.
General Pat Ryder at the Pentagon says the U.S. is deploying 900 troops now to the Middle East to beef up our presence. We've spoken already about the 2 carrier strike groups that are heading in that direction. How much are you viewing this? To what extent are you viewing this as a regional action as opposed to one specifically between Israel and Gaza, or the Hamas?
Everybody in the region, including Arab leaders who talk privately, not publicly in front of their peoples, but privately, know that this is the big one. This determines whether Iran and the various terrorist surrogates of Iran will evermore dominate the region, knock out Israel, prove that the United States will not stand by its friends and backs down in the face of Iranian threats. That's all in play now. Nobody on our side at least wanted this, but this is where we are, and there's only one way forward, which is to reinforce and be ready to respond dramatically if Iran intervenes.
Well, so with that said, when a ground operation or invasion, whatever we call it, begins against Hamas in Gaza, what will be the regional response? We've already talked about Syria. We could talk about Iran. We could even add Turkey to the conversation. What's this going to look like?
Everybody will stay out except the big question, Iran and its surrogates, particularly the most powerful Lebanese Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, with 170,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel and tens of thousands of troops. 3 scenarios. One, the United States massive it's wanting to deter Iran, and Israel defeats Hamas in Gaza, and Iran being deterred will be shown as a paper tiger. 2, Iran actually does intervene and this huge American force defeats again.
Yeah, I wish we had a better internet connection, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the time. We'll be, I hope, blessed by the Wi-Fi gods next time we speak. James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. He ran the coalition, was the special presidential envoy of the coalition to defeat ISIS. And so we've been using him for perspective on this as we get closer to what appears to be a ground assault. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington as we assembled our panel, including Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, who is actually with me here in Washington. It's great to see you at the table. Rick Davis with us as well, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Great to have our signature panel together on a Friday. Every time we talk to the ambassador, it's a sobering conversation, and he's clearly thinking about something wider, and I know I was leading him in that direction. But, Jeanne, when you start seeing headlines again of U.S. jets, American flags on these jets, striking targets in Syria, this is bringing back some pretty tough memories for people already.
It absolutely is. And, you know, you can't help but think about it and talk about it, rightly so, because this is what we are seeing unfold before our eyes. And as much as the president, the administration, Republicans and Democrats alike in the U.S. would like to avoid that, I mean, containing this was the key focus of the administration's policy as soon as this horrific event happened on October 7th. And yet it looks like despite all these efforts, that is increasingly difficult to imagine they're able to do that. And so now the U.S. is going to have to respond. And that's what we are seeing. And this raises all sorts of challenges, domestic political challenges among them. But most importantly, the safety of U.S. troops on the ground and Americans living over there as this continues to spiral out of control, which is what it looks like is going to happen in just a few hours, let alone days and weeks.
I sure wonder. Rick, we spoke with retired General Wesley Clark yesterday about this, about the idea of a second or third front potentially being open already. Here's how he put it. I guess we don't have the general here, but he was essentially saying, Rick, that this is not hot, it's warm. And I wonder your thought right now as you look at this from a regional perspective.
The things we have to understand is that Iran does not completely control all these malign actors, right? I mean, like, we think of them as almost like divisions of the Iranian military, but they're not, right? They're independent political organizations. You know, they're terrorist groups that kind of like, you know, operate in somewhat of a vacuum, and both for security reasons, but also just they don't even agree with each other, you know, on what ultimately the objectives are. Some are more interested in attacking the Americans than they are the Israelis, like what's happening in Syria right now. So part of this is, I wonder, you know, with all the flare-ups that we're seeing outside of the primary conflict between Israel and Hamas, is whether or not Iran is sitting back going, holy smokes, this could really get out of control, and all of a sudden we'll get dragged in to this conflict. I mean, Iran is really good at creating problems for other people through their carve-outs, but they don't like to get their hands dirty directly. And they still have reminiscence of 1 million men being slaughtered on the battlefield with Iraq. And so, you know, having a border war is not something they particularly are interested in. So this could actually spin out of control, not just affecting us in Israel, but also it could spin out of control of what Iran has as an expectation.
Here's what General Wesley Clark said when we spoke about this yesterday.
Well, let's put it this way, they're warming it up. But I don't think the decision's been made by the Ayatollahs to really open up the northern front yet. It's just it's nuisance right now. Yeah, they're killing people, they're firing, but they haven't really committed. They want to wait and see what Israel is able to do in Gaza, whether it's so deeply enmeshed in Gaza that it can't defend itself from the north.
Only have a minute left for this part of our conversation, Jeanne, but is this your biggest worry?
It is. And, you know, the Wesley Clark is talking about they haven't made a decision. And I think my bigger fear in a lot of people's is that the decision will be made because some kind of accident, somebody gets hurt, gets injured, more than one person, American troops get, you know, hurt, and that sort of spirals out of control. So questions of whether they decide or not aside. This is what the fear is that it is such a warm area. It could turn hot very quickly and people respond. And that's a huge, huge challenge.
We've got a lot more to talk about with Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, including the ask for funding for Israel. The new Speaker of the House has weighed in on this officially. He says, bifurcate the money. We'll hear from his interview with Fox News on that and a lot of other issues, whether the government's going to shut down next month. Next with Rick and Jeanne. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. It's the fastest show in politics. We'll have a lot more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We told you around this time yesterday that Hakeem Jeffries had issued a challenge to the new Speaker of the House. Yeah, Mike Johnson, that's his name. To take a shutdown off the table for the rest of the year, for the rest of this session. And I guess we got our response. Speaker Johnson sits for his first interview on Fox News. Asked about the continuing resolution that might be required to avoid a government shutdown. And the answer is yes, with conditions.
We're going forward. Chip and Byron are at the table with others. We're working through this with the ideas and trying to ensure that if another stopgap measure is required, that we do it with certain conditions. And I think there'll be conditions the American people can live with and a consensus that we can build around here in the House.
Certain conditions. As we reassemble the panel with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, I don't know what conditions we're talking about here, but if so-called Chip and Byron are writing the CR, that would be Chip Roy, Byron Donalds of the Freedom Caucus. I believe they wrote the last one, or at least were involved in the deal making here. Is that going to look like anything Hakeem Jeffries wants to sign?
Probably not. And it's probably not going to look like anything that the Senate's going to want to sign. So you can already tell that we're going to get into a haggle between these two institutions, the Senate and the House, over what this is going to look like. My guess is that the Speaker is not going to want to create a imminent shutdown in his first month of office, and so whatever those conditions are may be more manageable than even what we saw the first time around when the first CR was being negotiated. But at least there's an expectation that there will be a CR. And I'd say that is not something I would have assumed, considering the lack of, sort of fiscal experience that this speaker has had.
Or the fact that the last guy got fired for doing that very same thing, Jeanne. What do you think of this, those certain conditions? As a Democrat, can you see the other party voting for what's going to come out here?
I thought what was interesting was he was talking about what's palatable to the American public. And that's really beside the point. This has never been about what's palatable to the American public. It's about what's palatable to the far right wing of his own caucus. They are the ones who are opposing these CRs. They are the ones who have put all these conditions on. And so that is going to be his fight.
What are the conditions? Cuts?
Well, they are going to want to make cuts. I mean, we are just talking about Israel. He wants to separate out Ukraine and Israel.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, the list goes on. And so what has changed? Maybe, just maybe, the far right has decided they want to give him some runway, to Rick's point. Maybe they want to give him a honeymoon period of sorts for the first month or 6 weeks where he doesn't face an imminent shutdown. But I don't know that we know that yet. So he faces that as his big fight. And then, of course, if he tries to do what Kevin McCarthy did for a period of time until he signed the CR, which is to, hold hands with the far right, you're going to have the moderates of his caucus who are going to balk, and to your point, Democrats. Sure. And so nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed, and I wish you guys would call him by his name, MAGA Mike, the only thing has changed is the person who is sitting in this very difficult seat, who has got all of this ahead of him, and who comes with almost no experience. He's never even chaired a committee.
So is a shutdown more or less likely?
I think it's a little less likely only because they may wise up and want to give him some runway room. But I'm not convinced that we've heard that from either of these two warring sides of the Republican caucus at this point.
Well, we started this hour talking about Israel, and there is a big ask for money. It's over $100 billion for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border. If you listen to this show, you know that already. Speaker Johnson asked about that as well last evening, and he made it clear that he doesn't want to bring a combined piece of legislation to the floor. Here's how he put it.
I told the staff at the White House today that our consensus among House Republicans is that we need to bifurcate those issues. I agree with your assessment in Ukraine, and that's why the American people are demanding some real accountability for the use of those dollars. Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, but we have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility over the precious treasure of the American people. And we have to make sure that the White House is providing the people with some accountability for the dollars.
Rick, he just said a lot there, and I'm not sure what he means by accountability, if that's some sort of an audit or whatever that comes with the money that's allocated. But his approach here, and I know it's shared by members of his caucus, or he wouldn't be doing it, I guess, to take the Israeli money out and bring that to the floor alone, I imagine will only slow things down. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure it'll slow things down, and they'll have the Senate right on top of them with the sort of combined kit of funding that they'll have to deal with. And if they don't get onto it, they'll have to deal with a Senate bill that will be much more difficult for them to carve up. I would say, as the speaker just said, he's not caving to Putin, so that's reassuring, and he's saying he's for funding. In fact, he goes on in that same interview to talk about how he's not as concerned, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but to paraphrase, he's not as concerned about the money going for weapon systems, because he knows what we know, which is most of that money is spent on U.S. weapons manufacturers. He's concerned about the economic assistance, which is part of this formulation. And that has had fewer sort of strings of accountability. That goes right into the Ukrainian economy. And it's necessary, almost if not equally necessary as the security aid. But the administration has been slow to sort of talk about what specifically those funds are going to be used for. And I think that's part of the message that he's sending to the White House is, let's drill down on that before we just give you a blank check.
What do you think of this approach and what it will actually mean for getting help to Israel? We can treat these separately because Rick makes some very good points about Ukraine. But is this going to mean a longer wait for Israel?
It very well could. There's a reason that the Biden administration and Mitch McConnell and others want to go big on this, because you're really only going to get one bite at this apple. That's why they're putting $106 billion plus in and trying to get this through. But, if you just listened, as I like to do for you, Joe Mathieu, to Steve Bannon's show, and you listen to Matt Gaetz go on that show and say the Mike Johnson assuming the speakership was a win for the MAGA right. It was a win for us. And so I agree with Rick that he's saying the right things last night. He is trying to be responsible with money. We agree with all of that. But that is all beside the point. If any of those folks decide they are unhappy, and if 4 of them decide they are unhappy as they did previously, we're back where we started from. So, you have to listen to what they're saying. Nothing about the structure of the position he finds himself in has changed. We've changed the person, but we haven't changed all of the environment going on there, and the environment is unhealthy, and that has to make all of us skeptical this gets through as one package.
Well, so, Rick, it sounds like the administration needs to do a better job messaging what this Ukraine money is for. General Wesley Clark talked about it yesterday. You just made reference to, American defense contractors. This is about also replenishing what we have here. Wouldn't that be a better argument than simply saying $60 billion for Ukraine?
Yeah, and I think those conversations are being had within, the walls of Congress and the White House. But again, I mean, part of President Biden's job is to convince the American public that this is important and that we are doing the right thing, because that, of course, helps reinforce his standing with Congress. I mean, if the American public are behind him, then it's a lot easier to get these recalcitrant Republicans to do the right thing on Ukraine specifically. Everybody wants to write that check for Israel and the emergency assistance and the border assistance. Those things are going to be easy. The only thing that's going to be tricky is to get a straight vote on Ukrainian assistance. And frankly, that was what I thought was so smart about combining it, because they can just get that done in one swell swoop and ride on the backs of those more popular measures.
Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our signature panel, with us on the Friday edition of Sound On. We've got some breaking headlines from Israel that we'll talk about, and we haven't even gotten to this yet. Joe Biden has a new challenger in, can we call it the Democratic primary?
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
There is a Democrat running for president. His name is not Gavin Newsom. I don't think Joe Biden is losing sleep over it, but the representative from Minnesota, Dean Phillips, is running. The ad is up. The exclusive interview has been had. Here's what it sounds like. You ready?
I'm Dean Phillips, and I'm running for President of the United States of America. And I'm coming to New Hampshire to answer your questions. I love New Hampshire. I spent my summers as a kid in the White Mountains going to camp. Got to canoe the Saco River, learned how to fish, learned how to shoot a gun. Got to climb the presidential range, including Mount Washington.
Got the gun reference in there. I used to go to New Hampshire as a kid. I can't imagine that really being the way I introduced myself to the nation running for president. But he had more to say when he sat down with CBS News. Here is, again, Dean Phillips.
Are you running for president?
I am. I have to. I think President Biden has done a spectacular job for our country, but it's not about the past. This is an election about the future. I will not sit still. I will not be quiet in the face of numbers that are so clearly saying that we're going to be facing an emergency next November.
An emergency in a hypothetical race against Donald Trump. Let's reassemble our panel with Jeanne Zaino at the table here in Washington and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeanne, are you shaking in your boots here? Is Dean Phillips the next Democratic nominee? What's he thinking?
Having climbed Mount Washington many times and spent many summers on the presidential range,
Excellent.
I have to say I do like that introduction. I appreciate it.
I went to Six Gun City as a kid. Does that count? White Mountains?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's beautiful. So he knows what he's doing when he's putting that out. But, there's a reason, as you said, Gavin Newsom and, some of the other very popular governors who he, let's not forget, not that long ago said should consider running. There's a reason they're not running. Is because, number one, it is very, very late at this point. And number two, it's going to be difficult to get name recognition, get yourself out there against an incumbent president. And number three, I think biggest of all, is that no Democrats want to be spoilers and help Donald Trump get elected. Yeah. So, there's a lot of reasons they aren't running. That said, I think Phillips has a point when he says, looking at the polls, almost 7 out of 10 Democrats are concerned about Joe Biden's health, about his age, and they are looking for new leadership, particularly young people and African Americans. So he is trying to build on that. I don't think Joe Biden's worried at this point, nor should he be, but I do think it's something Democrats have to take seriously. The polls have been unswavering and unwavering. I don't think swavering is a word, but unwavering on this point about concerns about Joe Biden's ability to serve another 4 years. And he is taking that mantle and running with it.
What do you think, Rick? Should we take this campaign seriously?
I don't think you can take it seriously from the point of view of Joe Biden losing the nomination. I think you can take it seriously from a Democrat, who has credibility with independent voters because he's in the president's own party, criticizing the president's age, which they care about already, is probably one of the most important things that's driving their vote preference. So this is a horrible thing for Joe Biden. But they kind of set it up for themselves. I mean, this idea of bypassing Iowa, New Hampshire, and, we're going to start the primary in South Carolina. I mean, this is like a gift. I mean, if he can't win a state that the president's not even on the ballot, then he should really wrap up his political career. But the bottom line is, it's sort of misstep after misstep by the Biden campaign. And now they got to pay the piper, and this is not a shock that somebody would come out of there in a different generation who wants to contest this. And by the way, they are dying to get Donald Trump to be the candidate against them next November, because you look at every other matchup with people like Nikki Haley, and it's a lot worse for President Biden. So I think if they can set this table the way it is now, they'd be happy to sort of try and run. But as you've seen from our own Bloomberg polling, even that is looking pretty grim from a targeted state basis, where in places like Arizona and Georgia, Donald Trump's already got a lead on the president. So it's a pretty tough fall for the president right now.
Well, Dean Phillips said in his interview with CBS, Jeanne, that he was alarmed, is the word he used, by the prospect of Donald Trump beating Joe Biden after studying polling data that compelled him to make this move. Are you alarmed when you look at the numbers now?
Very alarmed. And the Bloomberg poll showing that in those 7 swing states, Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden. In 5 of those, they are tied in 1. And
so
Biden
you do not assume Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump?
I do not. And I agree with Rick. It has long been the view of the Biden folks that get Trump on that ballot. In fact, the only way we can win is against Trump, because we can show him as crazy and him as, unable and somebody who should not be reelected to the presidency. So let's get him on the ballot. But the danger here is be careful what you wish for, because in these matchups in this Bloomberg poll, Trump is winning. He is overperforming in those states. It is an enormous concern. And the biggest concern for Biden, putting Israel, Ukraine, everything aside, is the state of the economy. For people in their daily lives, living expenses, inflation, the price of gas, the price of groceries, and housing, mortgages. Young people can't get mortgages. Their mortgages are 7-8%, as you know. So, boomers are looking at 3 and 4% because they were lucky enough to get in early. All of that bodes very poorly for the president, and they have to take that seriously, because those constituencies are critical for them to win, and they are not feeling good about where the economy is right now. It's not to say the president hasn't done some really important things, but the economy is still it, and it is not a good sign for Joe Biden.
Rick, we only have a minute left. We've talked a lot about a no-labels candidate, about even Cornel West's campaign. Do you put Dean Phillips in the same category as a potential spoiler?
No, I mean, I think that the reality is he'll be long gone by the time the general election occurs, and people like Cornel West and Robert Kennedy and the no labels candidates, if they have them, are going to have an actual impact on votes that would otherwise be cast for Trump or Biden. So no, he will be the sort of winter candidate, the winter soldier of the Democratic Party, and all of the sort of heroes of the Democratic Party will emerge in January and February and March to ensure that this winter soldier gets beat just like if it was a Marvel comic.
Wow. That's brutal. Rick, thank you. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our signature panel, and a great conversation on a Friday. Wow, we learned a lot this week, and we lived through it with Rick and Jeanne, and Kailey's on the way next. Hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome to Friday and Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, alongside Kailey Leinz. She is with us now. We made it to the end of the week. It's good to see you. I'm just trusting myself that it is Friday, because I've thought that a few times over the last couple of days. It better be indeed. At least we got a speaker. That got done. And we heard from and saw the speaker in action. He sat down with Sean Hannity, did an extended interview on Fox, in which I learned probably more about Sean Hannity's views on things than the new speaker, but that's sometimes the way it goes.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about a couple of the breadcrumbs he left for us here, beginning with a continuing resolution. Kailey, this is the very thing that basically got Kevin McCarthy fired.
That's correct.
A short-term bill that would keep the government from shutting down, in this case on November 17. But it sounds like there could be some strings attached to this one.
That was his suggestion. He acknowledged that he's working against a clock here. They only have about 3 weeks or so to get something done. So it does seem like a continuing resolution. Another stopgap measure is going to be what has to happen while they continue to try to pass single subject appropriations bills. And what he said was, you got Byron Donalds and Chip Roy working things out, and there's going to be conditions. We don't exactly know what those might be. The speaker last night suggested that they would be ones the American people could live with. But basically, Joe, there's going to be a catch.
That's right.
Kind.
It sounds like it. Not sure what that is. It's almost like you watched the interview. Here's
all 41 minutes of it.
We're going forward. Chip and Byron are at the table with others. We're working through this with the ideas and trying to ensure that if another stopgap measure is required, that we do it with certain conditions. And I think there will be conditions the American people can live with and a consensus that we can build around here in the House.
And so this is where we begin our conversation with Congressman Tim Burchett. He's back with us, the Republican from Tennessee's 2nd District. Congressman, it's good to see you. You're probably really glad to be home after the throes of the last weeks here in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you're glad to have a speaker, and I wonder to what extent we should read into certain conditions and what a package here might look like.
I don't know if you want to read too much into all that. The reality is that a continued resolution was originally, I believe the history of it was under an emergency situation, and then it just got abused by the swamp or whatever you want to call it, both parties. And
is this an emergency?
And I was going to say this could be an emergency. We ran up against the barrier last time, but if you remember, we took off, as we've done under Democrats and Republicans, the whole month of August and 2 weeks into September. And, and we pushed it right up against the September 30th deadline. So this is a little different. This speaker has just taken over, and obviously he's getting his feet wet up to about the top of his hairline, I guess. But but I think he's done pretty well, because yesterday he passed a very tough appropriations bill, and it got through with overwhelming Republican support, which is something you didn't see under the prior speaker. So I think, as I've stated, you got a new sheriff in town. His name's Mike Johnson, and he's doing a good job.
Indeed, and I would say he's not necessarily just getting his feet wet. He might have just been thrown right into the deep end, Congressman. As we talk about a continuing resolution, which I know historically is something that, or an idea, a concept you haven't been ultra supportive of, what conditions would you need to see in order to vote yay on that bill?
Well, I'd like to see some real border security, not what the president's putting down, of more bureaucrats to allow illegal aliens to get further into our country and never show up at court, and they're just there permanently. And I'd like to see some of these funding, single issue funding bills, things like that. I mean, just on down the line. But I think he's going about it the right approach. He's asking us our opinion, and not telling us his opinion. And so I think that's a different style of leadership, something we're not used to. And I think and it's some honesty, too, that we're not used to.
Well, it sounds like you're going to have some conversations about the form that this takes. As he says, Chip Roy and Byron Donalds are authoring something. I don't know how soon you think you're going to see it, but there's also a supplemental budget request worth more than $100 billion coming your way from the White House. And last evening, Speaker Johnson made it clear that he does not want to address Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border all in one package. I'm going to let our listeners and viewers get a sense of this in his answer, Congressman, and hear your reply. Here's the Speaker.
I told the staff at the White House today that our consensus among House Republicans is that we need to bifurcate those issues. I agree with your assessment in Ukraine, and that's why the American people are demanding some real accountability for the use of those dollars. Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine, because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. we're not going to abandon them, but we have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility over the precious treasure of the American people. And we have to make sure that the White House is providing the people with some accountability for the dollars.
So he said a lot there, Congressman, and I'd like to hear you speak to accountability when it comes to Ukraine, what that would look like, what kind of system can be put in place that might make you feel better about accountability and auditing maybe the money that's already been spent. But let's start with Israel. If the Republican conference, if the speaker brings that to the floor as a standalone, knowing that the Senate, the White House don't support it that way, do you worry that that would slow down potentially money getting to Israel?
No, I don't. You know, they already have pretty much on auto check $3.8 billion that we supply. We've just sent over, hasn't been much reported, and it's out in the public domain, so I can talk about it, but there's been 2 more of the Iron Dome implements have been sent to Israel that we had. We've got the Gerald R4 carrier group, probably, I mean, that's the biggest, that's the biggest dog in the park. You put that thing in the Mediterranean, and everybody knows it's there, plus 6 more. Probably mercenaries on the ground everywhere. And so I think Israel knows where we are, and the last thing they really want is our military presence on the ground there, boots on the ground in Gaza, because of our rules of engagement, and their rules are totally different. You know, our rules of engagement got, at the end of Afghanistan, got a bunch of people killed because they wouldn't take out a bomber, a suicide bomber, and I talked to the sniper who had him in his sights twice, but was told by the war pimps at the Pentagon that he couldn't take this guy out. So Israel doesn't need that. But I think Israel knows where we are. But why would you, knowing that there's going to be an objection, why would the President of the United States allow that bill to come out with Ukraine money tied to it? Because he wants to put somebody in a political spot. And that's the only reason. We haven't been doing anything. It's been probably the most productive 20 some odd days, really, if you want to look at overall outcome, by electing Mike Johnson, our speaker. But what's the Senate been doing? They haven't been doing anything. We haven't even seen this. They haven't even sent the bill over yet. So, it's just politics as usual in Washington. Cut the BS, send 3 different bills over, send one with Ukraine, send one with border security, or so-called border security, and send one with Israel. That's all you got to do. 3 sheets of paper. And yet they want to politicize it and want to try to tie it up. They're the ones, I submit to you, they're the ones tying it up. Let's get to business. Let's cut the garbage out and do what's right for the people of Israel.
But Congressman, arguably the reason why the White House is trying to tie these together is because there is a certain resistance to continuing to fund Ukraine within your party in the House of Representatives. Are you saying if the White House were to send 3 separate packages, that Ukraine bill could pass on the House floor?
Yeah, I mean, all the Democrats would vote for it, and you probably, we had 100 and some odd votes, I think, in favor of Ukraine the last time something came through. That's stupid. Just send it over there separate. If they want to really pass it, do it separately. I would vote against Ukraine funding again, because there again, it's not our war. Show me the reason we're over there. If we're going to say that, look, we got dictators down in Central America that are abusing people. The Chinese are putting the Uyghur population in concentration camps. Why are we not going to war with China over it if we're so ethically challenged on this front? Ma'am, this is just politics.
Well, I'm not the guy with answers, but the administration says that if Vladimir Putin succeeds in Ukraine, and I know a lot of Republicans on the Hill agree with him, that it would be a national security problem for the United States and our allies in Europe. And is that part of the argument that you disagree with?
I disagree with that premise. The GDP of Russia is somewhere between France and Canada. This is a European situation. Let them decide it. Europe needs to be kicking in more money. They're not. The number 2 contributor to this whole thing in the beginning was Estonia. We were profiting off of both sides because of, and we were funding both sides of this war in the beginning because of the oil situation. This thing and the shady dealings that have been going on between them and people in Washington has been going on too long. And so eventually we'll get to the bottom of it. It'll probably be our grandkids that, a made for TV special or something, if TV is even around then. But it's a crooked country, and people are getting fat. I get too many reports of stuff from people that are there in Ukraine telling me that the
people
stuff we're
what about the people who are starving, who are dying? That the civilian death has been overwhelming, has it not?
What about people dying in this country because we don't have the guts to preserve our own border?
Well, I don't want to get into a what about conversation with you. We're just talking about Ukraine.
No, I know that, but I'm just saying, our priorities are out of whack. We put the focus on Ukraine, and yeah, it's awful, but there's stuff going on all over the world that's awful. People are starving to death in Africa. We've got these dictators down in Central America. There's people that are being brutalized in Central America, Mexico, for instance, on our borders. They're at the will of the cartels, people getting raped and murdered every day. And yet we're not doing anything about that, but we're all the way
and Congressman,
across the. Go ahead.
Congressman, there's people being killed in bowling alleys just this past week. What should the response be to yet another mass shooting in the United States?
It's a mental health issue. You've got a guy who apparently, from what I understand, got these guns. He was a reservist in our own military. There's obviously a problem there. The thing that ties in every one of these folks together is mental health issues. It's a mental health crisis. They could do it with a gun. They could do it with a knife. They could do it with an automobile. You remember one of the largest mass killings in this country, Oklahoma City, was done with ammonium nitrate fertilizer you could buy at Walmart, literally, and diesel fuel. And he killed over 100 people. And so it's just we've got a mental health issue in this country. And until we address that, this will continue. It'll just move into another avenue. We lose more people to drunk drivers than we have to mass shootings, but nobody's wanting to outlaw alcohol or cars.
All right, Congressman, well, on the subject of things that are against the law, or at least people have been accused of breaking the law, just yesterday, several of your colleagues from New York introduced an expulsion resolution for Congressman George Santos, who, of course, has been indicted on a number of counts. When that comes to the floor next week, would you vote to expel him?
Probably not, ma'am. We've got a court of law. Let's let it work. Let's let it work. You're still innocent until proven guilty, and you can have dozens of accusations you can indict. I remember an old Democrat buddy of mine who was a very prominent lawyer in Nashville and was a state senator as well. He used to tell me, he said, Tim, you can indict a cheese sandwich, a ham and cheese sandwich. And I never really thought anything of it, but I did, an indictment is just an accusation. Until he goes to court and is found guilty, that's another issue. But indictment is just
these are some pretty wild accusations, though. For you, is it a process issue? Would you feel the same way if you had a wider majority?
No, it wouldn't change it one bit. And I'll be honest with you, George is my buddy. George is a friend of mine. I worry about folks. I've lost friends to suicide and other things, and I don't.
Is that a worry for George Santos?
No, but I don't. You never know. You never know. And that's what I always tell him. I say, George, or I tell other guys. I've told other members of Congress that both parties that have been going through indictments or troubles at home or things. I say, look, I'm a Christian. I'm not a very good one, but I worry about people. I worry about their souls.
Well, Congressman Tim Burchett, I appreciate the time, sir. I wish we had more of it. This is Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.